Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching this story from now on. It will keep you interested all the way through. In the mountains of Kentucky, in 1977, there were secrets that should never have been told. One of these places was deep in the woods. At that time, the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky were pretty far away from the rest of the country. There were not many safe roads. Most of the people lived in small towns that were spread out across narrow valleys and steep hills covered in oaks and pines that seemed to reach the sky. It got cold early and stayed cold late, turning trails into icy, dangerous paths. Families needed each other to stay alive, and a man's word was more important than any signed paper. A man named Thomas Pike lived in this faraway place. People outside of Harlan County didn't know who he was, but his name would be whispered around campfires for decades to come. Having talks. Neighbors said Thomas was a quiet man who didn't like going to local events and didn't go to the county seat very often. He lived by himself on a property that was far away and surrounded by thick forests and streams that wound through moss-covered rocks. Thomas's house was at the end of a path that not many people were brave enough to take. A simple building made of planks that had turned dark from age and the smoke from the fireplace. The front door and small windows were almost always shut. The door creaked in a way that made people think twice before knocking. A poorly built fence surrounded the property. The wood posts were driven into the ground in a random pattern, as if someone had given up in the middle of the job. Thomas Pike bought and sold furs and went trapping. People in the area often did this because raccoons, foxes, and even bears could provide valuable hides to people who knew how to prepare them. Every 2 or 3 weeks, he would go down to Harlan with heavy sacks tied to his back. Trade the furs for food like flour, salt, kerosene, and gunpowder. When they came, he didn't say much. He paid what he owed and then walked away. Merchants in the area didn't like him very much, but they did business with him anyway. People told me Thomas had a strange look in his eyes, like he was always figuring something out or measuring distances that couldn't be seen. Some people said he never smiled. Some people said his hands were always dirty, even after being washed. But these weren't clear. Impressions, like what you say about someone who likes being alone. Something changed in the fall of 1907. Another group of hunters who were in the area said they heard strange sounds coming from Thomas's property. They said the sounds were screams that were muffled and could be heard in the forest at night. When asked what these sounds were, the men looked at each other awkwardly and changed the subject. No one really wanted to think that something bad was going to happen. But there was already doubt. A traveling salesman who sold medicines and household goods in the valleys decided to stop by Thomas's property a few weeks later. The salesman, whose name was Elias Garner, was well known in the area. He always had a funny story to tell and brought news from other countries, so everyone trusted him. Around noon, Elias knocked on Thomas's door, hoping to sell his goods and maybe get a hot meal before going on his way. Thomas didn't answer, though. Door. One more time. Elias knocked, called his name, and waited. Nothing. There was no sound at all, only the wind rustling the branches of the trees nearby. Elias had a chill go up and down his back. There was something wrong with the place. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. He chose to go around the house several times, watching for signs of movement. That's when Elijah saw that the barn door was open. It had a strong, bad smell that he couldn't describe. Right away, identify. He slowly walked up and carefully pushed the door open. He was both interested and scared at the same time. Sunlight came in thin beams, lighting up the dust in the air. That's when Elijah saw something that made his blood run cold. The inside of the barn was a mess. The floor was dirty and had tools, ropes, and dark stains from being thrown around. However, what really caught Elias's eye was a stack of personal items in a corner. Hats, coats, boots, and bags made of leather. He realized these were things that travelers had brought with them, and there were a lot of them. Elias ran away, jumped on his horse, and galloped to the next town. He told the Harlan County Sheriff what he had found in a shaking voice. Sheriff William Dobbs got a group of people to help him and rode to Thomas Pike's property that same afternoon. In the next few hours, they found something that would change the history of that area forever and become one of. In the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky, the scariest cases ever found. There were many types of problems in the Kentucky mountains, including land disputes, family fights, and cattle thefts. Sheriff William Dobbs knew how to handle them all. He could feel something different in the air as he rode along the narrow path that led to Thomas Pike's land. The men with him were also tense and quiet. As the sun went down behind the mountains, it turned the sky orange and red, which seemed to tell us what was going to happen. When they got to the house, they saw exactly what Elias Garner had told them would happen. The windows were still shut, and the front door was locked. Thomas Pike wasn't to be found anywhere. The sheriff knocked on the door and said he was there. Then he waited in silence. The sound of a stream running over rocks and the wind rustling through the trees were the only sounds. Dobbs sent a signal to his men and told them to break down the door. There was a sharp creak as the door gave way. It was dark and cold inside the house. Ash that hadn't been lit was in. The fireplace, a table with food that is hardened, and a chair that is on its back on the floor. There was nothing on the walls to make them look nice. In the only room, there was an old mattress in the corner, with dirty torn blankets covering it. It smelled strong, like mildew, old smoke, and something else that no one could put their finger on. The sheriff went to the barn while some men searched the house. That's where the search really began. Light from the afternoon still got through the cracks in the boards, making light streaks that cut through the room, through the darkness. Slowly, Dobbs walked, taking in everything around him. The common tools that were all over the floor were there. There were axes, saws, hunting knives, and iron hooks, but the sheriff's number was strange and too high for a man who lived alone. The sheriff found a lot more than he thought he would in the corner where Elias had seen the personal items. At least 20 coats of different sizes were there, along with felt hats, straw hats, wool caps, and shoes for men and women, some with good soles and others completely worn out. There are leather bags with initials engraved on them and fabric bags with fine stitching. Everything there had a story about a person who had been there. Even stranger things were found by one of the volunteers. Documents were strewn around under an old tarp. They were letters from people to each other, deeds to property, travel documents, and maps that were written by hand. There were papers from 1903 that were found. Some were newer, from 1906 or so. Each one belonged to a different person, whose name the sheriff didn't know but would soon be forced to look into it. His men were told by William Dobbs to get flashlights and keep looking. The sun had already gone down, and the darkness made everything look even scarier. It was during this search at night that they found the thing that proved their worst fears. Deep inside the barn, under some loose floorboards, there was a hole dug into the hard mountain ground that could be used as a cellar. It took courage to go down into that hole. The first person to come down carried a lantern that was shaking in. His hand, roots hanging from the low ceiling and packed earth walls were lit up by the light. Then the man heard something that made him scream and run up. There were dead bodies down there. Proof that Thomas Pike wasn't just a weird recluse, but also someone who had done horrible things to travelers in the area. No one else was allowed to go down until dawn, according to the sheriff. They needed more light, More time to get ready and more people to watch. The group set up camp around the property that night and stayed alert. No one slept. Okay. The trees were swaying in the wind, and every sound seemed to bring a bad sign. It was quiet as the men talked about how Thomas Pike had been able to keep the whole thing a secret for so long and how many people might have gone missing there. More volunteers from Harland and nearby counties showed up the next morning. In the mountains, news always got around quickly. As rumors spread from person to person, they get more specific with each passing. But the truth, as everyone soon found out, was, it's worse than any rumor could say. When it got light outside, the sheriff got a group of people to go down into the basement and write down everything they found. 5 men came down, each with a flashlight and some tools. Something they saw down there was written down in a government report that still gives people chills when they read it. At least 8 different people's bodies were found, all of which had been buried in a way that showed no ceremony or respect. The victims were tourists who had been through the area at different times, traders were moving goods between towns. Families were moving west to find better land, and workers were looking for work in Kentucky's new coal mines. One thing stuck out to all of them. They had picked a lonely path through the mountains, where Thomas Pike's presence was very dangerous. The investigation showed that Thomas let tired travelers stay with him and rest on his property before continuing their journey. He seemed willing to help by getting food and water and talking about how dangerous the trails are at night. Then he attacked when his victims were less alert. His methods were different, but they were always quiet and meant to leave no clear sign. Inside the house, the sheriff found notes in an old notebook. In shaky handwriting, they were short notes with dates, names, and short descriptions. Things like March 15th, 2 travelers from the east, or July, a family of 4, no one knows where they're going. Thomas Pike had written down his crimes, maybe out of habit. Pride, maybe because they want to be in charge. Each entry was about someone whose life was cut short, whose dreams were broken, or who would never go back home. Where was Thomas Pike, though? Everyone had that question in their head. Elias Garner had been seen by no one since he left the ground. He had just disappeared into the mountains, leaving a terrible scene that would shock people all over Kentucky and beyond. The sheriff issued a search warrant and sent messengers to every county in the area. The search for Appalachia's most wanted man had just begun. The story of what was found on Thomas Pike's land spread like wildfire. In just a few days, newspapers in Louisville, Lexington, and even Cincinnati were writing shocking stories about the case. Reporters came to Harlem on crowded trains with heavy cameras and notepads, ready to write down every macabre detail of the story. The small town's streets were packed with people and things doing things they had never done before. This quiet spot became the talk of the whole country. Sheriff William Dobbs was too busy to do anything. Besides being in charge of the search for Thomas Pike, he also had to deal with the victims' families who were getting there. Some people came from North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, all looking for loved ones who haven't been seen in a while. Every story broke my heart. People who had sent their kids to work and then never heard from them again were looking for them, in search of husbands who promised to come back soon. Brothers are looking for sisters who went missing while they were traveling. It was painful and took a lot of time to figure out who the victims were. The papers found in the barn were useful, but many of the bodies were already badly broken down, making it very hard to identify them. The sheriff called Henry Wallace, a doctor from Lexington who specialized in forensic medicine, which was still a fairly new field at the time. Dr. Wallace carefully looked at the bodies and took careful notes on. Get a rough idea of their age, height, and any other important physical traits. One of the known victims was a draper from Nashville, Tennessee, named Robert Brennan. He was last seen in 1905 while traveling to smaller Kentucky towns to sell his goods. His wife, Margaret, had been looking for him for 2 years. She had written letters to sheriffs in several counties, put ads in the newspaper, and hired private investigators. She was very upset when she heard that Robert's things had been found on Thomas Pike's property. Right away, they went to Harland. Margaret Brennan had a strong will, but she broke down when she saw her husband's coat among the things that were taken away. She had sewn the brown wool coat herself, and there was a tear in the fabric on the left elbow. That small, private detail confirmed the worst thing she had been afraid of. Robert would never go back to his house again. He would never meet his grandson, who was born months after he went missing. He would never know that she had been waiting for him the whole time. He thought he was still alive at the very end, even though the odds were against him. A young blacksmith from Asheville, North Carolina, named Daniel Cooper, was another person who was found dead. He skipped town in 1906 when he was 23 years old. Daniel was going west because he had a job in a coal mine near Harland. Simple farmers who lived on a small farm in the mountains of North Carolina never got why their son stopped writing letters. They thought the letters were lost, or that he was too busy with his new job, all the way through. They had no idea what the terrible truth was. Even more people were shocked when they learned that one of the victims was a woman. Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old widow, was traveling with her savings sewn into the inside of her skirt. She was looking for a new life in a different city after her husband died. On a rainy afternoon in 1944, Sarah stopped at Thomas Pike's house to get some temporary shelter. She never got where she was going. In Louisville, her brothers thought she had changed her mind about the trip and chose a place to stay along the way. They had no idea that she had died in such a terrible way. As more people were identified, the search for Thomas Pike got tougher. The sheriff put together groups of skilled trackersmen who knew every trail, cave, and possible hiding spot in the Appalachians. They looked through thick forests, went down into deep valleys, and looked around in abandoned cabins. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed to have vanished. It looked like the mountain had swallowed him up to protect it. A dark secret. Some people in the area started telling stories they hadn't told before. A farmer remembered seeing Thomas Pike 3 years ago talking to a group of travelers near a fork in the road. A woman who lived alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere said Thomas had once come to her door and offered dried meat and asked about any strangers who might have been in the area. It was winter, and a sheep herder said he heard screams coming from Thomas's property. He hadn't gone to check it out because he thought it might be a ghost. The fights were between wild animals. All of these stories painted a scary picture. Thomas Pike did not kill on the spur of the moment when he lost control. He planned ahead, was patient, and followed a set of steps. He kept an eye on his prey, studied how they moved, and waited for the right time. He picked people who were traveling alone or in small groups, people that no one would miss right away. He gave them a place to stay when he knew they were tired and weak. After making plans, he carried them out with an icy coldness that was hard to understand. After finishing, after his examination, Dr. Wallace gave the sheriff a report with more disturbing information. They attacked in different ways, but all of them looked like they were caught off guard. There wasn't a long fight, and there was no way out. Using the trust he had built, Thomas moved quickly and without thinking. After that, he buried the bodies in the makeshift basement, kept their things as trophies, and went on with his life as if nothing had happened. But why? That was the question that kept coming up. Everyone who helped with the investigation. Thomas Pike did not have a lot of money. The things he stole were not fortune, but they were worth some money. Some of the travelers only had enough cash to get them through their trips. So, what drove this man? Was it wanting to get something? Was it a sick pleasure to make people suffer? Was he angry at the world for some reason that made him want to kill innocent people? Sheriff Dobbs couldn't sleep for nights trying to figure out what was going on in Thomas Pike's mind. He looked over every entry in the notebook, looking for hints about who the man was. But the records were cold and didn't show any emotion or reason. They were just dates, facts, and descriptions, like Thomas was keeping track of crops or business deals. There was no regret or explanation, only a detailed list of horrible things that were done. At the same time, pressure on the authorities grew. The families of the victims wanted justice. Every day, newspapers ran articles calling for action. In Frankfort, Kentucky's capital, politicians spoke out strongly against. People gave speeches about how important it was to catch Thomas Pike and put him in jail. At first, rewards were $100, and then they went up to $500, which was a huge amount for the time. Many bounty hunters from all over the country came to Appalachia because they thought they could find Cookie's most wanted criminal. It had been months, and Thomas Pike was still missing. The Appalachian Mountains were hit hard by winter, which covered the trails in thick snow and made the search an even bigger challenge. The temperature dropped. It drops sharply at night, to several degrees below zero. Tracking teams had to cut back on their work and only check known cabins and shelters as possible hiding spots where a fugitive might try to stay warm in the bitter cold. Police Chief Dobbs didn't give up. He told his men to keep an eye on any lone travelers who came through on any of the main roads that led out of Harland County. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties giving them detailed information about Thomas Pike. He had a man about 5 feet 7 inches tall, athletic, and with dark brown hair that is starting to turn gray at the temples. His eyes are an unknown color between green and gray, and he has a small scar on his left chin. But the Appalachian Mountains were very big and tough, a huge area with thick forests, hidden valleys, and deep caves that no one had fully explored. Thomas was the only one who really knew the land. He had been hunting in those woods for years and knew every shortcut and body of water, source, every place to hide. He had plenty of chances to disappear if he wanted to. During the winter, different reports of possible sightings came in. A lumberjack said he saw a man who looked a lot like Thomas near the border with Virginia. After a few days, though, trackers came and found no sign of it. A family on a remote farm in Leslie County said that someone had stolen food from their barn at night, leaving tracks in the snow that led to the higher ground, heights. Trackers followed the tracks again, but they disappeared in rocky areas where snow didn't stick to the ground. A few people also thought Thomas Pike was already dead. Even experienced mountain climbers could die in the winter in the mountains. A lone man would not have a good chance of surviving for long without a safe place to stay, enough food, or the right tools. He might have frozen in a cave far away, fallen off a cliff in a snowstorm, or been eaten by wild animals. This idea led to some. Some found comfort in it, but others were left unhappy. They wanted him to be caught. They needed to know. They wanted fair treatment. In the town of Harland, where the search was still going on, people tried to get back to normal, but nothing would be the same. People in the area thought that Thomas Pike's property was haunted. No one came close to it without a reason. It was against the rules for kids to play in that area. People who were traveling avoided the path that went by the empty house in favor of longer, safer roads. The case also altered how people saw strangers. In the past, people in the mountains were usually friendly. Christians thought it was morally right to give a tired traveler a place to stay. But after what was found on Thomas Pike's land, people started to doubt him. Doors that were easy to open before were now locked. More questions were asked over and over. More care was taken to check the documents. Fear had turned a friendly neighborhood into one that was wary and suspicious. In February 1908, 4 months after. Soon after the investigation began, something happened that raised hopes of catching the person. An email came from Pineville, a town in Bell County that is about 30 miles south of Harland. A man who looked like Thomas Pike had been seen buying food at a general store, according to the local sheriff. The suspicious store owner called the police, but the man had already left by the time the deputies got there. Sheriff Dobbs got his best group of trackers together and rode right to Pineville. He talked to the shopkeeper, an old man named Augustus Moore, told a stunningly detailed story of what happened. The man went into the store early in the evening, when not many people were there. He didn't say much, wore his hat low over his face, and paid with old silver coins. Hard cookies, kerosene, matches, and rope were some of the things he bought. The things that someone who planned to be away from people for a long time would need. Augustus Moore saw that the man's hands were cracked and rough from being out in the cold. Also, he saw that he had the smell of someone who lived outside, like they were burning wood and the ground was wet. But it was his eyes that really caught his attention. It was blank and far away, like the man was seeing people through them instead of at them. In the many years that Augustus had been in business, he had dealt with many types of customers. But this man made him feel strangely uncomfortable. The trackers went in the same direction as the trader and into the mountains south of Pineville. The terrain was even tougher than around Harland, with deep canyons, and their forest was so thick that even at noon they blocked the sun. They found ashes from campfires that had been put out and footprints in frozen mud, which were signs of recent campsites. Someone was living here, but they moved around all the time and never stayed in one place for more than one night. It took 5 days to catch them. Trackers followed the tracks all day, set up camp for the night, and got back to work early in the morning. They were getting near. It was real to them. The footprints and signs were still clear and the ash was still warm. But after that, something changed. Everything. A strong snowstorm hit the area during the night of the 5th day. It was so thick with snow that you couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. The wind was howling through the trees. The trackers had to find a safe place to wait out the storm. After 24 hours, when the weather got better, all the tracks were gone. There was a uniform white blanket of snow over everything. There were no tracks, footprints, or directions to follow. It looked like nature was working together to keep Thomas Pike safe, getting rid of any proof of his passage. The area was searched for 3 more days, but nothing was found. Thomas got away again, and he disappeared into the mountains like a ghost. Sheriff Dobbs went back to Harland, but he wasn't completely beat. Those never-ending mountains were where Thomas was still out there, and he knew Thomas would make a mistake at some point. All criminals do it. It was only a matter of time, being patient, and searching until he finally got lucky. How long would it take? How many nights he would have to stay awake until justice was done? Even months after the bodies were found, families of the victims kept coming to Harlem. Some people came to get their loved ones' bodies once they could be identified. Some people just wanted to see the place where their loved ones had died. People had a need to understand, to be close, to make sense of their absence, and to mourn. The sheriff treated each family with kindness and respect. He tried to help and give them information, but he knew that nothing he said could really ease their pain. In the Kentucky Appalachians, spring slowly came in 1998. As the snow melted, trails that had been hidden for months became visible. Streams began to flow again, fed by mountain snowmelt. When the trees came back to life, they covered the hillsides in shades of green that stood out against the gray of winter. Even though it was a new year, Sheriff William Dobbs and the victims' families had nothing to look forward to. I felt refreshed. There was still an open wound that was bleeding quietly. During those winter months, something cool took place. Strange things happened to people from all over the area over the past few years, and they started to talk about them. A woman from Middlesbrough said that in 1933 her husband had stopped at Thomas Pike's property to ask for water for his horse. Thomas was nice, but he was cold. He offered the traveler water but nothing else, and he looked at them as they left with a serious look that the man will never forget. Another story came from a minister who preached in different towns. He remembered talking to Thomas Pike many years ago at a fork in the road. The minister had tried to talk about faith, forgiveness, and God's love. Thomas listened without saying a word and showed no emotion. He then left without saying anything. A scary thought came over the minister. He had looked into the eyes of someone who was completely empty inside. There were also merchants who remembered strange deals. Thomas Pike sometimes sold things: fine pocket watches, wedding rings, Bibles with handwritten notes, and handkerchiefs with women's initials sewn on them were some of the things that weren't from a single hunter. When asked where these things came from, Thomas always had a ready answer. He would say that he bought them from other travelers, found them abandoned on the trails, or that they were passed down from generation to generation. The merchants never thought he was telling the truth. They believed what he said without much doubt. Question: Dr. Henry Wallace, the doctor from Lexington who had looked at the bodies, kept working even after he got home. As a result of what he had seen, he often wrote to Sheriff Dobbs and gave him information about Thomas Pike's behavior. In an in-depth letter sent in March 1908, the doctor suggested that Thomas might have what some European scholars were starting to call a pathological criminal personality, which means that he or she can't feel empathy or regret. It was a new idea, but not very. Not only did the most advanced academics understand it, but it made sense in this case. Thomas Pike didn't kill out of anger or hopelessness. He planned his killings and did them over and over again. The trophies he took from his victims were kept by him like they were travel souvenirs, not reminders of the lives he had taken. He wrote down his crimes with the same level of objectivity that someone would use to write down household costs. There was no humanity there, just a cold, calculated logic that followed its own rules that were hard to understand. For now, a new plan was made to look for Thomas Pike. Sheriff Dobbs realized that to catch the criminal, he had to think like him. Thomas knew the mountains very well, so going after him directly would always be bad. Instead, Dobbs chose to focus on the places where Thomas would have to show up eventually, like general stores, known water sources, and trails that led out of the area. He set up a network of informants and paid people in the area to tell him about any strange behavior. The plan almost worked. In April, someone in Clay County, north of Harland, said they saw a man camping by himself next to a river. The description was right. The sheriff set up a careful operation to surround the area overnight with the goal of catching the man in the morning. But when it was time to act, they found out he was just a prospector, someone who goes into the mountains to look for mineral deposits. The man was scared when the person came up behind him and almost fell down. There were a lot of these kinds of false alarms. Every week, someone saw it again, and every week the trackers went after it, but they never caught it. Find out it was someone else. Another traveler by themselves. Another mountain hermit who wasn't connected to Thomas Pike. As the frustration grew, so did the rewards. Now they were offering $1,000 for the capture, which brought in more bounty hunters but also caused more confusion and false information. In May, something happened that changed how the case looked. Elizabeth Hartwell, a reporter from Louisville, went to Harlan to write about the case. Elizabeth was known for how hard she worked on her investigations, and not only did they want to know the facts, but they also wanted to know how Thomas Pike had been able to work for so long without being caught. Elizabeth spent weeks talking to locals, visiting the abandoned house, and talking to the sheriff and his men. She found a pattern in the kinds of people Thomas picked as victims. They were always temporary residents, travelers who didn't have strong ties to the area. They were people that no one would miss right away. In a way, they were invisible. They were people who had gotten lost in society. Not that many people noticed. The reporter also looked into Thomas Pike's past. She found out that he had moved to Harland County in 1898, which is about 10 years before the horrible discoveries. No one was sure where he came from. Some people remembered that he talked about Tennessee. Some people thought he was from West Virginia. There were no official records or papers that could help explain where he came from. It was like he had just appeared out of nowhere, fully formed from being cold and alone. Elizabeth was able to find an old man who sold the land to Thomas Pike in 1898. The seller, whose name was Josiah Bingham, was in his 70s and had a bad memory, but he did remember some things about the deal. Thomas paid a small amount of cash because the land was poor and far away. During the talks, he didn't say much. He just asked how quiet the place was, how many people went by, and how far it was to the nearest town. Based on these details, it looked like Thomas had a plan from the start. He didn't pick this property just by chance. He specifically looked for a place that was out of the way so that he could work without anyone seeing or hearing him, where screams would not be heard and bodies could be hidden without anyone finding out. It was a choice that was made on purpose and showed that the person was planning horrible things to do before they happened. The reporting that Elizabeth Hartwell did for the Louisville Courier in June 1908 had a big effect. Not only did she report the facts, but she also called into question the social structures that let people do what they did. Go away without a trace. Why was it so simple for travelers to just disappear? Why weren't there better ways to keep track of where people were? Why did remote communities work with so little oversight from the government? Many people were troubled by these tough questions. Elizabeth's work also gave the victims a human side that the official stories had missed. She looked for pictures of some of them, talked to their families, and told stories about who they were before they met that terrible person. Thomas Pike. Robert Brennan was more than just a dead store owner. He was a good dad who added poetry to the edges of his letters. Sarah Mitchell was more than just a widow who went missing. She was brave to decide to start over in life after losing someone close to her. Daniel Cooper was more than just a young blacksmith. He had big dreams and wanted to see more than the mountains where he was born. The Appalachians got very hot in the summer, and the investigation picked up speed again. Deputy. With the help of his network of informants, Dobbs was now getting daily reports from dozens of places in 5 counties. Everyone who worked on the farm, traded, or just traveled the trail regularly was on the lookout for Cookie's most wanted man. Constant pressure made it impossible to breathe. Thomas Pike could no longer go where he pleased without being seen. In this setting, a disturbing theory came to light. What if Thomas Pike had never come back to the area? What if he did? Had gone west, crossed the Mississippi River, and become lost in the vast plains beyond? Or he might have gone south into the Louisiana swamps, where a person could get lost forever in the bayous and small towns that didn't bother to ask questions. It was possible, and it scared people because it meant he would never be caught and justice would never be done. But Sheriff Dobbs didn't think it was true. He had looked at every piece of evidence about Thomas Pike that was out there. Note in the notebook for each item kept in the barn. He came to the conclusion that Thomas would not leave the mountains. This was his land, his kingdom, and the only place he felt in charge. Men like Thomas Pike didn't run away into the unknown. They hid in the familiar because they knew more about the area than anyone else. Dobbs thought Thomas was still out there in the mountains, waiting for the search to end so he could go back to living in the shadows. In July of the 1908, 9 months after the investigation began, the first solid lead in weeks was found. Outside of Letcher County, a group of goats found a cave that clearly had been inhabited not long ago. There were pieces of a fire pit, the bones of animals that had been hunted, and even some tools. When the herder heard about the reward, he ran to the closest town and told the police. He arrived at the scene with a small group of trackers, which included 2 Cherokee men who knew these mountains better than anyone else. Anyone. On a steep slope, behind a curtain of vines and thick brush, the cave was hidden. If you didn't know where to look, you could almost not see it. It was a great place to hide. Inside, they found proof that backed up their worst fears. A pair of boots that matched the descriptions given by people who had seen Thomas Pike years before was found in the cave. There were also pieces of fabric that looked like they were cut from a jacket, maybe to make patches, put on bandages. But the most telling thing was a small notebook that wasn't the one found in the house and had new notes in it. They had notes about where to get food without being seen, observations about how people moved, and descriptions of trails. Thomas Pike was writing down his escape with the same level of care that he used to write down his crimes. Cherokee trackers were very careful as they looked over the land around the cave. They found partially erased footprints going northeast and going up even higher. It was likely a few weeks old, but the tracks still showed the way. Dobbs quickly put together an expedition because he knew that every hour lost meant Thomas had to travel farther. It took 10 days to chase them. It was so steep that they had to use ropes to climb mountains. They crossed icy rivers with water up to their waists, and they slept in makeshift tents while it rained so hard that the ground became slippery mud. The journey was very hard and pushed the men to their physical limits, but they kept going because they were sure that they were finally going in the right direction. After 8 days, they found another camp that had been left empty. Even less time had passed since the last one, maybe only 3 or 4 days. It looked like someone had slept there because there were ashes that kept some of their heat when they were moved. These were the remains of a roasted rabbit. When the Cherokee trackers saw what happened, they looked at every part of it like it was a book. They found the fugitive to be by himself, moving quickly but carefully, and it was likely that he knew he was being watched. The stress in the group got bigger. They were close. It was real to them. During the night, they stepped up their guard and kept 2 men awake at all times. Their guns were ready to go. At this height, the mountains were different. They were wilder and less friendly. The constant wind bent the trees, lichen covered the rocks, and mists that came out of nowhere made it impossible to see more than a few meters. It was a good place for the man who had changed into something other than human to go on his last hunt. On October 10th, one of the Cherokee trackers saw smoke coming from a narrow valley about a mile away at dawn. The smoke was very small and hard to see. It looked like the kind of smoke someone would make when they were trying to blend in. The sheriff quickly put the group together. They split up into 3 groups, and each one came at the valley from a different direction. This made a siege that was hard to break. They went down in complete silence, using only hand signals to talk. Every move was planned, every branch that could snap was stopped. They moved slowly, like hunters who know that being too quick can ruin months of work, and it took them more than an hour to cover that kilometer. Each man's heart beat fast when they finally got close enough to see where the smoke was coming from. Someone sat with their back to them next to a small fire. He was skinny and wore dirty, torn clothes. His hair was long and messy. He was concentrating hard on his task of roasting something over the fire. He didn't seem to know at all that ate. Men with guns were quietly coming at them from 3 different directions. It's also possible that he knew but no longer cared. He may have finally broken something important in his spirit after months of running through the mountains. The signal came from Sheriff Dobbs. The men moved forward at the same time, guns drawn, and told the fugitive in a firm voice to raise his hands and stay still. The person next to the fire stopped moving for a moment. His shoulders tensed as if he were thinking about running. Then, very slowly, he raised his hands and turned his back on her. It had been 9 months of searching, but finally Sheriff William Dobbs looked into Thomas Pike's eyes. The meeting was a bit of a letdown. There was no fighting, trying to get away, or making loud, dramatic noises. Thomas didn't do anything as the trackers surrounded him. He took the handcuffs with the same lack of interest he showed for everything else. After months of living outside, his face was thin, sunburned, and scarred. His eyes were the same as eyewitnesses said it was as cold and empty as stones at the bottom of a river. When they were going down the mountain, Thomas didn't say a word. When the men tried to question him, he kept quiet and stared straight ahead with a blank look on his face. It seemed like he had shut himself off from the rest of the world and closed all the doors that could lead to it. The fact that they wouldn't talk made things even more upsetting. There would be no confession or give a reason. Nothing that could make the families of the victims feel better or help them understand. The news of the capture got around quickly. After 3 days, there was a huge crowd in Harlem when the group got there. A lot of people, who were tense and quiet, crowded the streets to see the man who had been following them around for a long time. A few women cried, some men yelled bad words, but most people just stood there and looked, trying to figure out how someone who looked so normal and human could have done such horrible things. It was taken Thomas Pike. Straight to the Harlan County Jail, a red brick building in the middle of town that was only used to lock up drunk people fighting or chicken thieves. No one had ever been held there before for such serious crimes. Sheriff Dobbs took extra safety measures like putting armed guards on continuous shifts and making the bars stronger to make sure that no one could lynch anyone. There was tension in the air, like the public's desire for revenge might be stronger than the law. In the days after the capture, lawyers from Frankfort came to make sure the trial followed all the right legal steps. The governor of Kentucky had said in public that Thomas Pike's case would be a model case that showed that the law would win out over chaos even in the most remote parts of the state. Beginning to gather evidence, the prosecutors got ready for one of the most complicated trials ever held in that part of the country. Thomas didn't say anything during the first questions. He sat down in the chair with. He sat with his hands on the table and stared at a spot on the wall the whole time. He never looked at the people who were questioning him. He didn't say anything when asked directly about the crimes. He didn't do anything when the evidence found on his property was shown to him. It was like he was only there in the physical world and his mind was somewhere far away and out of reach. A psychiatrist from Louisville was called in to check on Thomas's mental health. Dr. Edward Pritchard was one of Louisville's few mental health professionals. That they were trained at universities in the East, where these kinds of problems were starting to be looked at more closely. Using brand new techniques from psychological analysis, he tried for 3 days to start a conversation with Thomas. The results were not good. The report by Dr. Pritchard says that Thomas Pike showed no remorse or empathy at all. Legally speaking, he knew the difference between right and wrong, which meant he was sane and responsible for what he did. However, there was something deeply wrong with the way he felt. Other people weren't real people to him. They were just things that he could use whenever it was convenient for him. It was more than just being mean. It was cruel in a way that medicine was just starting to understand. At the same time, the families of the victims started coming back to Harlem, hoping that this time would bring an end to this terrible tragedy for good. Margaret Brennan, who was married to the Nashville merchant maid. The long trip with her grown son by her side. The young blacksmith Daniel Cooper's parents came from North Carolina, even though they were very old and sick. People from other victims' families, communities, and friendship groups came to this small mountain town in search of justice. The trial was set to happen in September 1988. The prosecution had a strong case because they had a lot of physical evidence, expert testimony, and careful records of everything that was found on the property. But there were also problems, some of. The bodies were in a state that made it hard to identify them accurately. Thomas's notebook entries were shady, but they were not specific enough to connect specific crimes to specific victims. It was hard to make sense of all the pieces of evidence that didn't directly support the main claim. A man named Samuel Hawkins was hired by the court to defend Thomas Pike. He didn't want the case, but he couldn't say no. Hawkins knew that having to defend Thomas would hurt his. That neighborhood is a living hell. He knew that even the worst criminal had to have a good lawyer because that's how the justice system works. He didn't try to show that Thomas wasn't guilty, which was obviously impossible. Instead, he focused on technical issues, questioning whether or not certain searches were legal and the flow of some evidence. Thomas didn't say anything during this time of getting ready for the trial. He didn't help with his own defense, give any explanations or reasons, and he showed no interest at all in the proceedings that would decide his fate. He didn't do anything except eat when he was offered food and sleep when the lights went out. It was very uncomfortable for the guards who were watching him. Not having any prisoners around was easier to deal with than being alone and angry. Elizabeth Hartwell, a reporter, went back to Harlan to cover the trial. She was able to talk to Thomas for a short time through the bars of his cell, with Sheriff Dobbs by his side. She asked carefully thought-out questions for 15 minutes, hoping to learn something, anything, about the man who had done the crimes. Thomas gave her one full look in the eyes. In that moment, Elizabeth felt something she had never felt before, a complete lack of anything, like staring into a black hole where a soul should be. This meeting was written about in her reports, and the way she described it gave her chills. "There are no monsters with horns and claws," she said. Wrote, "The real monsters are people who dress like us and sneak up on us. Thomas Pike could be your neighbor, the man selling firewood on the corner, or the stranger at your door asking for water. And that's what makes it all so scary. Evil doesn't make its presence known. It's just sitting there waiting for the right time." The weather in September was just the kind that Appalachia is known for. It was cool in the mornings and warm in the afternoons. The first signs of fall were mixed with the last breaths of summer. Summer. A lot of people had never been to the Harlan County Courthouse before. There were people in every seat. There were a lot of people in the aisles and outside waiting for news. There were reporters from major newspapers from all over the country ready to write about every part of what looked like it would be a historic trial. Everyone was very quiet when Thomas Pike was first brought into the courtroom. The government gave him simple, clean clothes to wear. He had shaved and cut his hair short, and he almost looked good, but the eyes that were empty, told a different story. He sat next to his lawyer and didn't show any emotion. He also didn't look at the people who were watching him with a mix of horror and interest. Harrison Carter was the judge in charge. He has worked as a judge in Kentucky for many years. He knew how important the case was and how much responsibility it came with. In the beginning of the trial, he made it clear that it would be conducted with respect and dignity, that he would not stand for emotional overreach on either side, and that justice would be done. Through the law, not what most people want. His words were firm, but they also had a sad tone to them, as if he knew that no matter what happened, the damage would never be fixed. It took 2 full days to choose the jury. It was almost impossible to find 12 men who could judge the case fairly. The crimes were known to everyone in the area. After everyone had formed an opinion, they were able to put together a jury that included a farmer, a merchant, a teacher, and a blacksmith. Men who said they would look at the proof with an open mind, even if they already knew what they thought. In the days that followed, the prosecution's case was put together with great care. As each witness spoke, they added another piece to the macabre puzzle. Sheriff Dobbs talked about what was found on the property. The jury could understand what Dr. Wallace said about his medical findings. The people who owned the businesses knew what Thomas had sold over the years. Family members found things that belonged to their missing loved ones. The most. Margaret Brennan, the widow of one of the Nashville merchants, gave a powerful testimony. Her dress was full of grief, and she walked up the days with honor, holding the brown wool coat she had sewn for her husband many years before. As she spoke, her voice was firm, and she didn't make Robert sound like a faceless victim. Instead, she told him that Robert was a man who loved music, who played the violin on cold winter nights, and who hoped to grow his business so he could give his kids a better education. Margaret talked about the 2 years she spent. She had been looking for Robert and sent letters to sheriffs in dozens of towns, but they never replied. She had trouble sleeping at night, wondering what could have happened. She talked about how her world fell apart again when she got the news, and how the hope she had been holding on to for so long was brutally put out. Then, with tears running silently down her face, she turned to Thomas Pike and asked, "Why? Why did he take her husband away? Why did he hurt her family so much? Why had he picked this dangerous path?" Thomas did not answer. His blank face never changed as he kept staring straight ahead. It seemed like he wasn't there at all, and Margaret's words were just noise. This total lack of concern for real human pain was more shocking than any violent response could have been. A number of people in the courtroom started to cry. Judge Carter himself had to take a moment to calm down before he let the trial go on. The parents of Daniel Cooper also spoke, an old farming couple who had bought for months to get from North Carolina to Florida. The father, whose hands were clearly shaking, talked about how proud he was that his son got the job at the mine and how he had written excited letters about the trip, but then the letters stopped coming without any explanation. The mom's voice broke every time she tried to start a sentence, so she couldn't say much. In the end, she just showed the jury a worn-out picture of Daniel that was taken right before he left and asked them to remember that each victim had been. Someone was loved, and their death left a hole in the lives of those left behind. The defense didn't have much to work with. Samuel Hawkins did his best, but he did raise some technical issues and say that some identifications were not clear. He also said that circumstantial evidence did not prove absolute guilt, but even he didn't seem to be sure. What do you do to defend what you can't defend? How do you make people doubt your story when the property was packed full of proof? Hawkins used procedural issues as an excuse, but everyone in the room knew what was going on. I knew it was just a formality that had to be done. Thomas Pike was never called to the stand to defend himself. His lawyer didn't call him because they knew that being quiet would hurt more than help. And even if they had, Thomas had made it clear through his body language that he didn't want to talk. He was completely separate from everything, as if he were already not there, even though his body was still there. The trial went on for 14 days. Every day brought new revelations and details that painted a more and more a bleak picture of the accused. It turned out that Thomas had been working for at least 5 years before he was caught, and maybe even longer. The notebook that was found in his house had notes from as early as 1903, but there were signs that there might have been other notebooks and other victims who haven't been found or who have disappeared without leaving enough of a trail to be linked to the case. A criminal behavior expert from Chicago who was brought in just for the event gave most of the people there new information. He spoke up. That predators like Thomas Pike often started out with small crimes and then moved on to bigger, worse ones. Robberies turned into fights, and fights turned into even worse violence. The expert thought that Thomas may have started committing crimes a long time before 1903. possibly in a place other than Kentucky before moving there. There was no way to know for sure, but the theory made sense and was scary. Many people in the town of Harland were worried about the trial the whole time. Every night, taverns were full of people, talking about the events of the day. Pastors led special prayers in their churches to ask God to give the families of the victims strength and the jury wisdom. There were some business owners who closed early to go to court. The whole community seemed to be frozen, unable to think of anything but the case that had revealed a terrible secret among them. When the last arguments were over, the courtroom was so full that guards had to stop more people from coming in. The prosecutor gave an emotional but well-controlled speech, putting together a case that left no room for doubt by systematically linking each piece of evidence. He talked about each victim by name and honored their memories. He also reminded the jury that they weren't judging abstract crimes, but crimes that took away real lives, families, and dreams that would never come true. In his last defense, Samuel Hawkins did what he could. He didn't try to say Thomas wasn't guilty because that would have been silly, based on how strong the evidence is. Instead, he made a technical case for following the right legal steps to make sure that everyone, even the worst defendant, had a fair trial. It was a good legal argument, but it didn't make me feel anything. After he was done and sat down, he looked tired and happy to have finished his unpleasant duty. Before letting the jury decide, Judge Carter gave them clear instructions. He told them the laws they had to follow and what certain words meant. There are many nuances in the law that govern cases like this, but everyone knew that the instructions were mostly just for show. There was a lot of evidence. The guilt was clear. What the right sentence should be was the only real question. In the afternoon of the 14th day, the jury went to their rooms to think things over. It was thought to take at least a few hours, and some even thought they might have to come back the next day. However, it was a surprise when, less than 90 minutes later, the foreman sent word that they had decided. The word got around quickly, and it got full again in the courtroom. Everyone seemed to already know what would happen and was eager to hear it. The jurors' faces were serious and worn out when they came back. A farmer named Joseph Miller, who was in his middle years, stood when asked. It was so quiet in the room that you could clearly hear the sound of a sheet of paper being folded. Judge Carter asked the official question about the verdict. In a firm but meaningful voice, Joseph Miller said that Thomas Pike was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Everyone worked together. The room let out a sigh of relief, letting go of stress that had been building for weeks. Some people cried tears of relief, while others kept quiet to think about what had happened. Margaret Brennan shut her eyes and said a prayer in her head. Daniel Cooper's parents hugged each other, their bodies shaking from sobs they were holding back. It made them feel better to know that their grief had been recognized by someone else. Thomas Pike did not say anything after the verdict. He sat there the same way he always had, not caring, disconnected, and somewhere outside of normal. How people feel. When the guards lifted him and took him back to his cell while he waited for his sentence, he didn't fight them. His steps were automatic and didn't show any will. It was like seeing an empty shell of an automaton being moved from one place to another. The sentencing phase was set for a week after the verdict. This gave Judge Carter time to look over the whole case and decide what punishment would be fair. Over the course of those 7 days, Harlan kept his emotions in check. The verdict had caused some. It was a relief, but everyone knew that the real ending was still to come. The families of the victims stayed in town and stayed in simple guest houses. They shared their stories with each other and found comfort in being with people who knew what they were going through. Reports were still being sent to newspapers by journalists, but the tone had changed. It wasn't about covering a trial that was still going on. Now it was about thinking about what the case meant in a bigger picture. Some articles asked what society should do about people who showed that they had no morals at all. They argued about whether punishment could really do anything other than keep other people from going through the same thing. These deep philosophical conversations started because of a case that made people face the fact that real evil exists. Elizabeth Hartwell wrote a collection of essays about life in the Appalachians and how Thomas Pike was able to stay hidden for so long because of the area's remoteness. She said the case showed that there were problems with the way, how remote communities were supervised and kept safe. There weren't enough deputies patrolling the countryside. Across counties, there were no coordinated ways to keep track of travelers or look into disappearances. It was a hole in the system that predators like Thomas could easily fill. But Elizabeth also wrote with kindness about the mountain people, making it clear that they were not guilty because they didn't know any better, but because of where they lived and how much money they had. They worked hard and were honest, who trusted their neighbors because they needed it to stay alive in that harsh environment. Thomas Pike had used that trust in a horrible way, turning a virtue of community into a fatal weakness. When the sentence was given, the courtroom was once again full. The mood wasn't the same as the day of the verdict. It was less tense and more serious, with a solemn seriousness that showed how important the moment was. Judge Carter walked in wearing his robes and carrying papers that he had carefully looked over, put together the week before. His face showed that he had been up all night worrying about bad decisions that made him feel bad. The judge did something strange before giving the sentence. He let the families of the victims say their final words if they wanted to. Carter thought these people should be heard, and that their voices should be part of the official record, even though it wasn't common at the time. Ellen Brennan was the first person to stand up. She thanked the judge for the chance, and then talked to Thomas Pike directly, but he didn't seem to be paying attention. She told him that she didn't understand what about him made him able to do such horrible things, but she hoped that one day, maybe in his last moments, he would feel some kind of regret, not for himself, but for the victims' souls, who deserved to be remembered with more than indifference. She told him that she couldn't forgive him, but she would pray that he could find peace. If not, they would have to live in a world where people could exist without any humanity at all, which was too scary to contemplate. Several other family members also spoke, each with their own unique view on loss and grief. One of the victim's brothers was so angry that he said no punishment would ever be enough to make things right. A daughter of another missing person talked about growing up without a father and the important events he missed. She also talked about how his absence had changed her life in ways she wasn't aware of. Still finding out. People were angry, sad, and confused, and some really tried to find meaning where there didn't seem to be any. Judge Carter told Thomas Pike to stand up when the statements were over. He was helped to his feet by the guards, and he just stood there staring at nothing. The judge began his speech by talking about the serious duty the law put on him, and how people put their trust in the judiciary to find the impossible balance between justice and mercy, punishment and mercy, with redemption. But he made it clear that this case was different from others, because it tested these ideas in new ways. Carter carefully looked over each charge and every crime that the evidence proved. He talked about planned harm and the pattern of behavior that showed not a moment of weakness, but a choice to hurt others over time. He named the victims and treated each of them as a unique person who should be remembered and respected. Then, he said the sentence everyone knew in a voice that showed how serious he was about it, which no one saw coming, but which still gave everyone in the room chills. Thomas Pike was given the death penalty by hanging, which is what the law in Kentucky says must be done within 60 days. The judge said that the execution would happen in the Harlan County Jail, in front of officials and a small group of citizens, as the law requires. He ended by saying that he hoped the sentence would help the families of the victims find some peace, even though he knew that no punishment could really make up for what they had lost. Thomas did not answer the sentence. When the guards led him out of the room, he walked passively, his steps as stiff as ever. But just as he was about to leave the area where the families of the victims were sitting, he stopped. He looked at both of their faces for a split second, and there was a small change in his expression that was hard to miss. It wasn't really regret, maybe just a final admission that his time was up. After that, he kept walking and turned into the doors for safety. Heron had a strange 60 days after that. Things slowly started to get back to normal in the town, but everyone knew that the execution date was coming up like a countdown. The families of the victims slowly left, going back to their homes to try to put their broken lives back together. Before she left, Margaret Brennan left flowers at the nearby church, not just for Robert, but for all the people who have died in the mountains. Daniel Cooper's parents had a hole, and thought about everything while sitting on a bench outside the courthouse all day before making the long trip back to North Carolina. For the sake of history, Elizabeth Hartwell stayed in Harlan until the very end. She was determined to write down everything about the case. She went one last time to see Thomas Pike's estate, which was now empty and starting to fall apart. The walls were covered in vines. The windows started to break. Nature slowly taking back what was always hers. Elizabeth wrote that there was something that made sense. There is something poetic about this, as if the mountains were wiping out Thomas Pike's mark, refusing to keep any proof of his existence beyond the memory of people. In Thomas's last days, some pastors in the area tried to visit him in jail and offer spiritual advice and a chance to confess. His attitude toward these visitors was the same as his attitude toward everything else. He didn't say a word as they talked about redemption, salvation, and the chance of peace, even though he was going to die soon. He never replied, though, showing interest but never showed that what they said reached any part of his mind. In the end, the pastors gave up because they knew they were talking to an empty space that neither could nor would be filled. The execution date came around on a cold November morning in 1908. There was a lot of fall color in the Appalachians. The trees were red, orange, and gold, which stood out against the seriousness of the moment. The sky was gray and had low clouds that made it look like something bad was going to happen. The mountains were very quiet, like nature was holding its breath. Before dawn, a small group of official witnesses met at the Harlan County Jail. Of course, Sheriff William Dobbs was there, along with Judge Carter, the prosecutor, a few people from the Frankfort state government, and 12 citizens chosen by law. There was also Elizabeth Hartwell, who was one of the few women allowed to be there because of how important her work was to history, keeping track of the case. Everyone was dressed in dark clothes and barely spoke. Around 6 a.m., Thomas Pike was taken from his cell. He had spent the night before, like every other night, staring at the ceiling while lying still on his narrow cot. The guards said he hadn't slept, but also said he hadn't been upset or scared. He had just been there, waiting for what was going to happen with the same emotionless lack of presence that had marked his whole presence since. He was caught. They gave him a last meal the night before, which was seen as a kind thing to do, even for someone who was going to be executed. Thomas ate without much interest and didn't show any signs of pleasure or disgust. He ate the food mechanically because he needed it as fuel, but nothing else. He shook his head when asked if he had any last wants or messages to leave. It was time to say goodbye and write letters to people who were important to you. He had always been by himself in the world. The gallows were built in the inner courtyard of the jail. They were a temporary but strong structure that was made just for this purpose. It was made of brand new wood that still smelled like pine resin, which was a strange smell for what was about to happen. The rope was already in place. It had been tested the afternoon before to make sure it would work. Everything had been checked more than once because Thomas Pike had to be put to death no matter what crimes he had committed, carried out with respect and skill. The sun wasn't fully up when Thomas was led into the courtyard. There was a dim, gray light that made it hard to see anything. While walking between two guards, he didn't fight back or actively help. He just let himself be led. His clothes were plain, clean, and not fancy. His hair was cut short again, and he didn't have any stubble on his face. He looked like someone tried to make him look nice, like that would matter. He went up the steps right up to the gallows, his steps firm and steady. At the top, he was put over the trappo, while the executioner, a man hired from Lexington just for the job, made the last preparations. Sheriff Dobbs walked up and read the sentence again, this time in a loud voice that could be heard in the courtyard. It was the right thing to do to make sure that everything was legal and that there would be no question about what was going on. When the sheriff was done reading, he turned to Thomas and asked him if he had any last words. It was the standard question, the last chance to say something or admit something. Thomas looked at him and then briefly looked over at the small group of witnesses. Then he spoke for the first time in months. His voice was hoarse from not using it much, low and monotonous, but it could be heard clearly in the early morning quiet. He only said, "There's nothing to say." Even in that last moment, they didn't feel bad about what they did, say sorry, or recognize the pain they had caused. They were empty. The man's words, which came from an empty heart, were more disturbing than any confession could have been. He didn't say he wasn't guilty, but he also didn't say they were important. To him, it looks like none of that mattered. The hood was put over his head so that witnesses couldn't see his face. He made sure the rope around his neck was tight enough to do its job. The executioner made one last change to make sure everything was in the right place. Then, the trap door opened. There was a brief moment of silence during which the whole world seemed to be on edge. Thomas Pike went through the hole and fell. The rope did its job quickly and well. It was over. The witnesses stood there for a while, thinking about what they had seen. Some people made the cross shape. Other people just bowed their heads and thought. In her notebook, Elizabeth Hartwell wrote down the exact time that Thomas Pike's official end happened. The 23rd of November, 1998 was 7:12 in the morning. A doctor in government confirmed that he had died and the body was taken down from the scaffold. There was no dying service. It was known that Thomas Pike did not have any family. There was no one to claim him or mourn his death. He was buried in a part of the county cemetery that wasn't marked, so there was no headstone and no ceremony. There was just a hole in the ground that was covered over and left to weather so that no one could find out where he was buried. People seemed to want to forget about him, just like they forgot how human his victims were. But people would remember the Thomas Pike case, not hard. Over the next few years, it was used as a starting point for conversations about crime and punishment, what evil is, and how societies should protect their weakest members. In 1910, Elizabeth Hartwell wrote a very detailed book about the case that became required reading for people who were studying the new field of criminology. She wrote the book to honor the victims, giving each one a name and a story so that they would be remembered as people, not just cases numbers. Thomas. In the end, Pike's property was sold at a court auction, and the money from the sale was split among the families of the victims as a small way to make up for their losses. The new owner tore down the house and barn, setting the pieces on fire and tilling the land completely. He put down new trees and let the land return to its natural state. He wouldn't take care of any buildings that were left over from those terrible events. Over time, the forest took back the land, and it was no longer possible to tell where it had been. Existed outside of mountain wilderness. Over the next few years, the roads through Appalachia got better. More deputies were sent to patrol areas that are far away. Systems were put in place to make it easier to keep track of travelers and look into disappearances. Even though these changes weren't perfect and there were still holes, the Thomas Pike case made the government realize that isolating people could hide horrible things that needed to be stopped. Margaret Brennan lived until 1943 and always thought of Robert. Those years. She never got married again because she spent her whole life raising the son Robert never met and working with groups that helped families of missing people. Before she died, she gave all the case files to the Tennessee Historical Archives. This made sure that the stories of Robert and the other victims would be told to future generations. His parents moved back to their farm in North Carolina and spent the rest of their days in peace and quiet. People around them said they never talked about what, kept their sadness inside because of what had happened. When their father died in 1915, they found the faded picture of Daniel that they had shown in court under his pillow. This showed that they had never forgotten about the loss, even though they had kept quiet about it. William Dobbs was sheriff of Harland County for 15 more years before he retired. After the execution, he never talked about the case in public, but people who knew him well said the memories kept coming back to haunt him. He got into the habit of hiking in the mountains when he wasn't working. In a land with so many dark secrets, they were always looking for something, maybe to find peace. Elizabeth Hartwell covered high-profile cases all over the country and became one of the most respected investigative reporters of her time. But she always said that the Thomas Pike case was the most important of her career, not because of how horrible it was, but because it showed how fragile life is and how important it is to always be on guard against people who are working in the shadows. People have been reading her book for decades, teaching new generations about the dangers that can be found in strange places. The case is still kept in Cookie's historical records as a sad reminder of what happened more than 100 years ago. The Appalachians are still beautiful and harsh, and they have been the setting for many stories of both triumph and tragedy. People still walk these trails, but they know things about them that people didn't know in 1907. They know that guests should be thanked for their kindness, but also be careful. They know that nice looks can hide bad intentions. They know that evil doesn't make a big deal out of being there. It sneaks up on people, waiting for a weak spot. Remember the people who died at the hands of Thomas Pike for how they lived, not how they died. A man named Robert Brennan loves music and wants a better life for his family. Daniel Cooper, when he was young and full of hope and drive. Sarah Mitchell for having the guts to start over. After loss, and all the other people whose names were written down in official records. Each of them had a valuable life and a story that deserved a different ending. This case should teach us that being alert is not the same as being paranoid when lives are at risk. May it teach us how important it is to have systems that keep weak people safe. May it remind us to remember the people who have died and honor them. And may it encourage us to build communities where trust isn't a fatal flaw and where people are also aware of the need to. Find danger when it sneaks up on you from behind the mountains in the dark. Once you're done with this scary story, if you want to learn more about other cases and mysteries that have changed history, you can subscribe to the channel and set the bell to go off when new videos are uploaded. Leave a like if this script kept you interested all the way to the end. And tell us in the comments below what historical case you'd like to see seen in the next episode. Your participation is very important for continuing. Bring these forgotten stories back to life until the next time they go on a journey through the